Hi there, everyone. I'm Ron Allen, a correspondent here at NBC News in New York, and welcome to this NBCU Academy panel on how journalists cope with dealing with traumatic events and burnout. And at the end of this, we hope to give you some practical advice on how you can handle those situations and how you can deal with all kinds of stresses that come with the job. If you're wondering what NBCU Academy is, it's a journalism and media training program that helps students and young professionals learn new skills and grow their careers. And we welcome you to check out more at nbcuacademy.com to learn much more. So let's begin the conversation. We have a very distinguished guest, including a couple of colleagues of mine, Antonia Hilton, who is a correspondent based here in New York and also the host of the South Lake podcast. Blaine Alexander is an NBC News correspondent based in Atlanta. Dr. Brenda Wall is a psychologist and grant director at Reclaiming Mental Health. And Dr. George James is a therapist and adjunct professor at Thomas Jefferson University. So before we get to the clinicians and the experts, let's start with you, Antonia. You were in Memphis. The Tyree Nichols situation is about as traumatic, perhaps, as it gets. Being in that kind of environment, looking at the video. So when you're given an assignment like that, oh, the other thing, please put your questions in the Q&A box, because we really want to hear from you out there as to what you think is important and how we can help. So again, Antonia, how do you prepare yourself? How do you approach an assignment like this, like going to Memphis or something like that?
Well, in this case, I didn't have a ton of time to prepare. I was actually already in Memphis covering another story. I was working on a story about how underfunded and unsupported many of Memphis's public schools are, a school district that serves a majority Black student body there. And so, connected issues, but not the same as having to watch a traumatic video like what many of us saw come out of this case. And so I was in town for a different education story. I was planning to spend time with kids and in schools. And then this news, that the next phase of this investigation broke. And I found myself from the DA's office to churches, to neighborhoods, talking to people in a community that was openly grieving and at a loss. And so, often when we have a heads up on stories like this, I spend a ton of time talking to people on the phone, doing what we call often pre-interviews, getting a sense of some of the people I might meet along the way, sort of emotionally preparing as well for the kind of story I will be covering, packing things that I like, that are fun to do when I maybe have downtime to take a break from that work. I didn't have the opportunity to come as prepared this time. And journalists are often thrown into surprise situations like that. And so you need to have sort of your first line things. Maybe it's packing books that you like to read that are fun, that are like beach reads that you can use to escape. For me, it's often packing little things like running clothes, hiking clothes, bathing suits, so I can go swimming if I even just have 15 minutes. I didn't have any of that this time.
No.
So what I had to do was make sure I was read in, get ready to get out there. And at first it was really about giving my all and my ears, listening to people on the ground and remembering that as flustered as I might have been, as difficult as the story is for Black reporters to cover these stories day in and year out, that the community comes first, the family came first. And so that was my first priority. Then at night, when I had opportunities to kind of take a step back, plan the next day's coverage, and calm down a bit, I made sure to do little things for myself, whether that's to make sure I go find great food in a city like Memphis, where there's lots of good stuff to eat.
Self-care is very, very important. Blaine, when we were talking about this before, you were saying that there's a stretch in the year 2020 through COVID, when people think of trauma and they think of war, conflict, violence, but dealing with the COVID pandemic is also a traumatic thing in some ways for many of us to deal with. How do you prepare and how do you take care of yourself in a situation like that, which here, Blaine, is happening over a long period of time?
Yeah, I thank you for that question. And honestly, I just want to say I'm so glad we're having this discussion, because I think that what I learned in 2020 when I would have a text with my journalist friends is that we were tired and it was hard. And we were all kind of feeling these compounded feelings of like, this is a lot right now. So I want to be really transparent. I mean, I think that when I think about the stretch of 2020, there was these kind of dueling forces that I think a lot of us can relate to as journalists. On the one hand, this was every story that we churned out was consequential. There were no just kind of filler stories, but everything really was kind of like people were watching us to see how they would survive. And then when, the race protest came, they were watching us like on the edge of their seats for that. These were moments that were shaping history. As you said, I'm based in Georgia. Atlanta. And so if you kind of think back to 2020, we had story after story after story after story that was leading the national conversation, whether it was Ahmaud Arbery, which I covered from start to finish, whether it was Georgia being the first state to reopen during the COVID pandemic. And then when the protests happened around George Floyd, a lot of the things that happened were in Atlanta. Rayshard Brooks being killed, Congressman John Lewis dying, the debacle with the 2020 primary. We had story after story after story that was kind of lining up and really just kind of creating this wave. So I think back on that time, I never worked harder in my career for a more consistent period of time than I did then. And work-wise, it really was just kind of this crucial, almost defining moment for my career. Right. But at the same time, it was difficult. It was tiring. I remember times when I would drive to my live shots in the morning after getting 2.5 hours of sleep.
That much, huh?
over the past few days. And I would just blast gospel music just to kind of try and get myself together to go out and do what I needed to do. And then what was difficult too was that personally it was just really hard. Like everybody that I talked to, everybody in my sphere was reacting to everything that happened to George Floyd, was reacting to the fact that we're living through this pandemic. And I personally was also scared, pandemic wise, and then feeling my own feelings. How did I take care of myself once I kind of lay all that out? One thing I had to do was create boundaries. I found that, especially when it came to conversations around race and policing and those types of things, a lot of people who were close to me, I would almost kind of be the recipient of their anger because they'd see me and say, you know what's going on, Blaine. How come those police officers didn't arrest those guys until da-da-da-da? I can't believe that guy did this. And like, I would get this anger that people, because they see me talking about it and know about it, they're like, let me talk to Blaine. And I had to really put up boundaries, including my own family, sometimes my own parents, like, guys, I can't receive that. I can't take that in because I have to have some.
And that I would imagine is quite hard. And I guess even before you get to this, let me ask you back, Antonia, why expose yourself to this? Because we don't have to be reporters covering violence and trauma and protests and COVID. You could be a consumer reporter. You could be a political reporter. You could be a feature reporter doing light things at the end of the show. So, Antonia, why do this?
Well, first, I am in part a political reporter, and the nature of politics these days actually means you're going to be at protests. You are going to have interactions or confrontations with police. You're going to be dealing with traumatic situations, whether it's a hurricane that the president or other lawmakers are responding to. Politics is so expansive. And so if you're an aspiring journalist who thinks that politics is a way to avoid covering traumatic situations, I have some tough news for you. But why go to a war zone? And when we were talking the other day, you said one of the hardest things you had to do is cover immigration stories at the border, sex trafficking story. Why personally put yourself in that situation? Well, look, this is deciding to become a journalist is you don't do it for the glory. You do it usually because you have a love of people. You are passionate about the community in which you live or the country in which you live, and you want to give a voice to people who don't have access, who don't have a platform often for themselves. You want to hold people in power to account, and often getting to those stories means you're going to be in really difficult, sometimes dangerous, or sometimes incredibly emotional and traumatic situations. I covered immigration for years, and I did spend a whole summer living in El Paso covering the family separation crisis. And I was working on a documentary at the time. And so I spent that entire summer with one family trying to find their 8-year-old son who had been separated from them. And that was one of the most difficult periods of my career. I spent almost every waking hour with this family. From breakfast, I watched their most difficult private moments. The family, obviously in complete agony and panic, looking for this 8-year-old. I traveled to Guatemala to meet other family members who were left behind and also worried about what had happened to their son when he arrived in the United States. And by the time that summer ended, I was so irritable. Like Blaine was saying, I would come back to New York and I would hang out with friends and they would be worried about, this or that. And every problem seemed so small. I had no patience for anyone. I was so angry. I actually had to go to my boss and say, I'm having trouble, regulating my reaction to things. I need to take some time off.
Right.
And she was so supportive at the time and was like, you did a great job. You gave a lot of yourself for 3 months on the border. Rest. But we do that work. We go in and then eventually come out of those situations, because if reporters don't go and tell these stories, people were not going to talk about what was happening on the border.
Right.
People who were separating children from their families weren't being honest at the time about what was happening there.
I agree.
Somebody has to do that work. And so, it's an honor, but you have to also be honest with yourself about what you have to do after the fact to heal so that you're ready for the next story and you can do right by the people who you're going to encounter along the way.
Right. I hear you. I think the short answer to that question that I often give is that because these are the stories that really matter. And when you feel like you're in a dangerous place, but you're doing something important, speaking up for people who don't have a voice and making decision makers take notice and do something, you get a better sense of satisfaction. And that's what always propelled me through these kinds of situations. Blaine, what about you? Why do you do this kind of work? Why not do something light, easier, perhaps, arguably? Why put yourself in these situations?
It's consequential. I think that this is kind of these, for me at least, this is one of the reasons that I became a journalist. I think that it's to help people understand what's going on around them, to amplify voices that you don't typically hear. That's kind of my North Star. One of my North Stars whenever I tell stories is, who are the people out here and whose voices can we amplify? What different perspectives can we expose our audience to? And so that really kind of guides a lot of what we're doing. And I think that in 2020, because of everything that was happening, that was the moment that at least those kind of pillars for me really came through.
Right.
I also think, like Antonia, I cover politics. I do feature stories too. I kind of run across the board. There are some fun things that I get a chance to do too. But by and large, certainly when you're talking about that concentrated period, yes, this was when it was consequential. And I think all of us in journalism know when there are times when you have to do things to kind of fill time or things like that. There was none of that during this stretch. I do think that one thing for me that really kind of also kept me going too was, it was cathartic for me. One thing that's difficult is that as a journalist, you can't share. So you can't really kind of say what your feelings are on a subject, or you can't really kind of, it was a time when everybody was at home and was posting about things. We don't do that as journalists, right? Typically, and so for me, I found catharsis in giving as much of my time to people to explain what they were feeling, or why this moment was difficult for them, or why they were taking to the streets protesting and literally risking their lives because we were in this pandemic, but going out and protesting day after day. So for me, that was in itself kind of healing and bringing perspective, my lived perspective, to stories and work in a way that I had never done before to that point.
Dr. George James, let me turn to you. You're the CEO of George Talks LLC, and you, I presume, see a lot of journalists and others who are working in so-called trauma-facing professions. How do you try to help people in these situations, and what do you see as identifying symptoms, if you will, factors that let you know that somebody really does need some help?
Number one, thanks for the question, and I'm just an honor to be here with all my fellow panelists. And this is a conversation that I've had a lot with people. As I was hearing Blaine and Antonia share, I think about like when we look at movies and we see somebody go deep undercover, or if we think about like an actor or an actress and what it means to really get into a character, it means you have to really immerse yourself in the environment and in that culture and in that community. And what they both have shared is that's what it means, in my opinion, that's what it means to be a reporter, right? So like you're in the midst of this and you're immersed, and it's overwhelming. And so some of the work that I do is helping people to have a space for themselves to talk about it, because just like they Antonia and Blaine just shared, sometimes they're the people that other people come to, and then sometimes you don't have a person for yourself. So that becomes the place that I can really help and support. And it's helping people recognize, I feel exhausted, I'm moody, I'm irritable, the things that other people are saying feel small, or I just don't want to do it anymore, or I find myself not having that get up and go. And so all these things, then I start to say to someone, well, maybe you're experiencing burnout, or maybe you need a break, or maybe you need to do those things that might be helpful for you. And sometimes just hearing that from somebody else sometimes gives them permission to say, okay, maybe I need to do that. I've been holding on to pushing forward, and that's not really healthy for me in this time.
Dr. Wall, we hear this term burnout a lot. What's the difference between burnout and a few bad days, or just feeling like it's
a lot of bad days,
had a tough time? When do you know you're like burned out and you really need to
you have burnout, perhaps, Ron, when you have a lot of bad days. So it is a chronic condition. Everyone so far has talked about handling stress. So it starts with stress. You're high achieving people, high functioning people, and journalists who are doing the work in the moment, you know how to handle that stress. You're professionals, you know what you need to do, and you're going to get it done. If you're in that situation over a period of time, it can lead to, well, the coping for stress is not going to necessarily help you when it accumulates. So burnout is cumulative. And it's traumatic. It's accumulation of trauma. And you get to a point where you don't feel good about work, and where you may question yourself, and where you may be irritable, and you have some of the emotions that go along with depression. So when you have those experiences, and when your work is not rewarding, and when you're not okay, you know when you're not doing what you want to do and feeling the way you want to feel, that's the burnout. That's the burnout.
There's a question from the audience asking about whether NBC provides mental health services after covering a story like Memphis or something else. I can tell you that, yes, they do. That the company encourages us to not just talk to professionals, but also to network with colleagues. Dr. Wall, do you find that it seems to me that is much more the norm these days, that there are services, that companies have become mindful of this than was the case 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And of course, this is harder if you're an independent freelance journalist, because you don't have that network around you that to support you.
There are many situations where you feel isolated. And so if you're freelancing, you may feel more isolated. If you're covering a trauma for a period of time, you may feel more isolated. And then the access to care is going to be important. You can get care from family, you can get care from colleagues, but if you get to a point where you are feeling very frustrated about your work, you want to make sure that you get some professional assistance as well. Like Dr. James, you want some professional support, because it is available. And even if your organization doesn't provide it for you, there are many alternatives where you can get help. You can do the EAP, that's a help. There are many places where you can get help. And thankfully, we have good help from a variety of sources available today.
There's a question that I'll turn back to Blaine and Antonia about. It says, what are ways that you have found to process and recharge yourself in the moment and in the height of a high emotional story, rather than pushing through to wait and recover on the other side? So in the moment, Antonia, how do you recharge yourself? And do you feel that this is particularly hard when you're covering a story in the Black community, in a community of color, where there's a special, I feel there's a special responsibility, and where the emotions can be that much more intense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to the first part of the question about things that I can do, this one might sound kind of funny. I have a very particular stance when I'm doing a live shot. So I used to sing in church choirs, and you learn that standing in a particular way and breathing through your diaphragm is important.
What
to
is
see
that?
it.
What is that? Can you?
Well, I'm not going to demo it on here, but
Because I
people
could
can
use
reach out to me
whatever helps. I could use it. Believe me.
Okay, well, I think it would be different for everyone, but I have a stance that makes me feel powerful, that makes me feel rooted, like I can't be knocked over if a gust of wind comes or a question kind of catches me off guard. And so when I am nervous or I've been on TV for hour after hour, which happens when you're on a big story, it just feels like it's nonstop. I'm like wearing the comfiest shoes I can. I have my feet rooted in a very particular sort of like wide stance. For me, that's what works. I'm not saying that's what works for everyone. And I take big, deep breaths through my diaphragm because that's what I learned when I used to sing in church. And that helps me. I take that deep breath. It gives me a second to recalibrate for a second before I keep talking. I think as reporters, sometimes when we're asked a question, we're on air, it's a live situation. We feel like we have to zoom through, we have to hit every single note. You still need to breathe. And it's okay for you to pause for a moment and consider and be a human before you jump in with the next answer, the next reaction, your toss to your sound, whatever it is, it's coming next, breathe. So that's one small thing that I do. I also keep pump up playlists. So I will go back in the car after my live shot and I will put on whatever song, whatever album is my thing right now. And I will sit in the car and I'll tell my friend or my producer, whoever's with me, like, sorry, we're rocking out right now. That's what we have to do for me to kind of get back to, I don't know, just feeling like I'm on Earth, like on this planet for a moment.
Right. It sounds like context is important. And I think, I try to do that in these kinds of situations is keep in perspective that there is more going on than this moment that is harsh and terrible and difficult to, and also, I would think it's tough sometimes to separate yourself from what's going on because you feel an attachment to the community. But I think there's also a need to just maintain this is something about the profession. We're journalists. We're not activists. We're not, at least many of us aren't. We're not there protesting. We are there for something else. Blaine, there's a question about video. How do you select your videos and images, trying to remain compassionate about the issue? It's a process, obviously.
Yeah, I want to actually answer the previous question very quick before I get to that. I think Antonia, our sister, is separated at birth because when you said the thing about posture, I do the same thing. I will very intentionally fix my posture and I'll roll my shoulders back and I'll put my head up. And that kind of gives me the same thing of like, okay, here we are. I'm focused, I'm dialed in, and I can do this. The other thing that I do that helps me immensely is I'll take meditation breaks. So like after I finish a live shot, I'll look and see when do I have 10 minutes in between here and this, and between this phone call and scripting for nightly and whatever, and say, okay, I'm putting my phones on silent. I am meditating for 10 minutes in my car. Whoever's calling me, I'm gonna call you back. And then I'll bring it back and I'll come back. And that helps root me, ground me. And it also kind of gives me a sense of at least control of myself, right? Like sometimes when you're on these big stories, it's not just the context and the story itself that's coming at you, but it's the crushing amount of work and requests and live shots and digital and, shows that are coming at you as well. So sometimes I have to block that out, take 10 minutes, do what I need to do, and then get back to the world. That helps. To your question about video, I think that you choose the video that tells the story. You choose the video that tells what's going on. I think that especially when we, in the context of talking about protests, there were a lot of really kind of hearty discussions about like, yeah, if 92% of the protests are people just marching peacefully with signs and singing, and then you've got like all this fire and people smashing out windows, but that's only like a small percentage. How do we put that into context? I think that context is so important. So like, yes, that element is happening, but that's not the vast majority. So the most of our piece is going to be what the 92% is. And then you write specifically to that video. I think it's important to make sure that you're not just wallpapering with like, hey, look what happened, and leaving people to draw their own conclusions. If you put that in there, it's like, yes, in the midst of all of this, on hour 9, something like this broke out and it led to 12 arrests and it led to one person being sent to the hospital and da. You put that into context and then you come back to what really the thing looks like. So I think it's context and choosing video that tells the full story and then writing to that intentionally.
But it is also true that we don't always have control over the video that's selected, particularly in a live situation on cable where they're running video editors, producers back in New York are selecting this thing. And that can be challenging, I think, for all of us at times, because the point is, the question is that in the field, you don't always have control over the video. Yes, when you're writing a script and packaging something as you were describing, you do. But particularly in this day and age when so much of what we do is live.
Yeah.
That
Can
can
I
be
jump in on
challenging.
that? I think that, yes, we don't have control over video. I always have control over what comes out of my mouth. And I kind of try and stay grounded in that truth, because even if I don't, like, I have no idea what, you do the split screens and who knows what's over there, what they're showing over there. But for me, I can contextualize as best I can. And sometimes when I know that there is that big video, I'll make sure to include in my live shots of, like, you've seen those images of cars getting burned or this police car getting burned out, but I was there and I'll tell you what I experienced and what, I've kind of basically in talking to people, this is what it looked like. So I'll do my best to kind of head that off at the pass and give the context for, even if it's not in my live shot, what I know a lot of people are seeing out there, and providing that.
Right. There's a question from a news director, which is great. And why don't you take this one, Dr. James? The question is, what can they do? What can a manager do to help break down the stigma associated with mental health so that reporters, student journalists, and others will get help covering traumatic stories and dealing with these issues that we're talking about? How do you attack the stigma, Dr. James?
Yeah, I think that leadership by example is always important. Being able to say, here are some resources. This is what we do. This is how we want to practice. Hey, have you checked in on yourself or your colleague? Being able to kind of have that as a part of the environment. Being able to say, to support that, we want you to make sure that you're taking rest or break. The fact that Antonia was able to say that, that her director was able to say, like, it's okay to take that rest. Sometimes reporters and journalists haven't had that experience. Sometimes they're being told, no, you got to cover the next story. So being able to know and create an atmosphere, an environment, and to say it is okay is something, a message that you want to create. And what that does, one of the things that I've done often in coming into these situations is to help people create psychological safety. Is it safe for me to say I need support? And is the environment safe enough for me to go there and then be directed to the resources? That helps to reduce the stigma.
But this is also tough for, I would think, early career younger journalists who are trying to make a name for themselves and who are trying to get the better assignments and, frankly, get a better job. So it's a bit of a fine line, isn't it? But I think what I hear you saying is that you do have to be an advocate for yourself. And in this day and age, there are people who will listen.
Yeah, and you can go to therapy and still do your job, right? So it doesn't have to be one or the other, right? Like, you can take the extra assignments. You feel like you need to do that to move further in your career, but also, as Antonia and Blaine has shared, they have really great tools and ways that they're taking care of themselves. If you don't develop that early, it will be a shock and overwhelming for you as you move further in your career. So that it's a great time to be able to do that, so you can do both.
I can tell you honestly, and tell everyone, that I see a therapist regularly, every couple of weeks, sometimes more when need be. And I've been doing it for, oh God, the better part of, let's just say, a long time. and it helps. And it really, I don't think I could be doing what I do without it, frankly.
Just Ron, that's the leadership by example. If more people were to say that, it makes other people feel like, oh, I could do that too.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Dr. Wall, there's a question. How can you avoid burnout when your newsroom is short-staffed? And when I could perhaps add, when your news director manager is asking you for more?
Part of what we've heard so far is how well these journalists handle stress. So if you're in the field, you're probably going to be able to handle the stress very well. You can probably handle the stress of a newsroom being short-staffed for a short period of time. It becomes a problem when over a longer period of time, you aren't able to regain the balance that you need in order to function at the level that you have the capacity to function. Mm-hmm. So when you have a short-staffed newsroom, you can handle that for a week, might be able to handle it for a month. But part of what you also want to be able to do is to establish boundary and establish a voice so that you can help the people around you look at what needs to shift. So a short staff newsroom, fine for a short period of time, not if this is going to be the way we save money and make it because we know you're young and you're not going to say anything, because we know you don't have a boundary and you're not going to force the people to look at the broader situation. So recover your voice, just as you're reporting on people who may not have a voice represented in the way that we need to have them. It's important for you to be able to recover your voice and establish the balance that's necessary to do good work.
Here's a question for Antonia and Blaine again earlier. Essentially, the question is, where's the line between pushing to find out more information to get a better story and potentially getting yourself hurt? So how do you find that and define that line when you do go down that street or you don't go down that street, or when you stay here or you leave, or when you get this close or when you don't get that close? How do you, Antonia, how do you find that line? How do you define it?
I'll be honest in that there's no easy answers. In the early part of your career, I feel you end up in situations where you have to figure out what that line is for you. And I'll tell you now that after doing this for a while in a number of different formats, for long form, for live TV, for short form, for digital, that I put safety first. That doesn't mean that I don't get the story, that I don't get great interviews, that I'm not working long hours and out there in the field, but I don't put myself in jeopardy and I don't put my team in jeopardy, particularly if you are a broadcast journalist. When you make decisions as the correspondent, as the producer, your decisions are affecting a number of people, including cameramen and women, audio operators, fixers who may be their translators who might be working with you, who are trusting you to lead them to places, into homes, into businesses, schools, where they expect to be safe and they have families to return home to too. And so I would caution people to err on the side of a safer judgment. And trust me, you know, there are going to be these moments in your early career where you want to be in the middle, in the thick of it, in the crazy situation, because you think that's going to make your career. I would argue so often some of those things do not. And we're living in a time right now where there are crises all the time. Unfortunately, there is always another big story coming around the corner. So if you feel that your bandwidth is fraying, your candle's burning at both ends, you should take a step back, because trust me, there will be another big one for you in just a couple weeks, and you'll have your voice, you'll get out there, you'll get another shot to prove yourself. And if you're working with a team of folks, they're going to really appreciate that you also kept them safe and you didn't push them too far. When you do this kind of work, you want a long career. And the secret to a long career is picking and choosing your battles, knowing when to be in the front lines and when to take a step back, when you need a good night's sleep, when it's okay to pull an all-nighter. You're going to make mistakes in your early career where you under and overestimate things sometimes. But once you figure it out, you'll develop a gut that you trust. And then your responsibility after that is to keep trusting your gut, because that's what actually helps you have a healthy career long-term.
And I would think it's very hard sometimes for young journalists to kind of, as you say, bridle things back a little bit, because I think it's true that the business does reward risk takers. Perhaps it shouldn't, but sometimes it does. And the other thing I would add to that is that when I'm going into a dangerous situation, I always try to, as best I can, select the people I'm going to go with and make sure that I go with people who are experienced and I follow their lead. And especially in very hostile environments where you need, and there are people, especially at the network level, who have been in war zones, who have grown up in that kind of environment, and you listen and you don't do dumb stuff, if you will. All right. So let me ask you the same question, Blaine, about this whole risk thing. Can you perhaps think of a situation where you think you might have just gone a little bit too far that you wouldn't do again?
You know, I don't know if there's one that I've gone too far, but I definitely have one where I have made a conscious decision to pull back. And I think that it's, I know that around the times when we were kind of seeing protests every night, I covered a number of protests in different situations over years in my career and local and network. there was something about what we saw, at least in the streets of Atlanta in 2020, that was very different because it felt like everybody was kind of on edge, much more on edge before. Like the law enforcement, the people who were out there protesting, it's for better or worse. It just was a very, frustrating situation for a lot of people. And there were a number of reports of, people kind of throwing fireworks and things like that, but there was also gunfire. And so I remember a couple of times when we were enrolling coverage and we were, going wall to wall, this was maybe night 4 or so, and we were kind of walking down these different areas where there were different conflicts and just kind of seeing what was going on, arrests, different things like that. And I remember there was this one area that just felt too dark. It felt too dark, and it felt like, now we're kind of chasing after, what are we actually going after? And it kind of goes back to that story of context. Are there kind of small skirmishes on different parts of the street? Is that worth going down if we're talking about a place that's dark, if we're talking about a late night, if we're talking about a situation that we've been in for the past few hours and we've assessed like, things may not be going that well. And so we called it and said, you know what, I don't know, but it seems that most of this is done here. We're happy to go back to our main place and report from there. But this kind of chasing the street and kind of going around different places, this isn't working anymore, and it's not safe. I think that there's power in that. I've never been in a situation, kind of to echo Antonia's point of trusting your instinct. And once you develop that and speaking, I've never been in a situation where I've said, this isn't good, we're not doing this, we're taking a step back, and that I've gotten somebody say, no, that's wrong, you keep going. I've never had that. And I know that I'm fortunate in that situation because I'm sure some people have, but I say that to say it's not broken my career. I've made those pushbacks a number of times, whether it's covering weather and saying, you know what, we can't drive to this area because the conditions aren't safe. The tornado just blew through. They're like, whatever it may be, and saying, we can't do this because this isn't safe. Or, there hasn't been enough rest, or, we're not getting in this water because who knows what's happening here. I've never had somebody say that's not an option, and I've never had it be damaging to my career. So take that and hold that as empowerment, because at the end of the day, you should be empowered to know that you're the person who's out there in the field who experiences these things. You have instincts. You're a journalist for a reason. You have instincts. And so you should be in a place where you feel empowered to communicate those back and say what you feel is or isn't safe.
And one thing I'll add as well is that here at NBC, MSNBC, and NBC News Now, there's training. We go through what's called hostile environment training on a regular basis, and you have to do this every 2 or 3 years or so if you're going out to cover hurricanes and wars and protests and the like. And so it's not it's instinct, and it's also taught. It's also learned. My mother used to always freak out when I was in a war zone, and I used to always tell her, we're managing the situation. We're not just kind of willy-nilly here. There are ways to do this and ways not to do this. And these situations are manageable. And again, it takes good decision-making and working with thoughtful, experienced people. Another question from the audience. How much say do you as reporters have in choosing the stories you report on? And combine this other question of how do you try to find your niche so that as you're starting out your career? So Antonia, why don't you take that one first in terms of how much control you have over where you go and what you do?
At this stage of my career, I have a lot of control. I have a beat. I cover politics and civil rights issues. And I travel all over the country, although there are a couple regions where I'm the most deeply sourced and I have a lot of long-term relationships. And so I pitch a lot, and a lot of my stories beget other stories. And so I often have a good sense of where I'm going to be, how the stories I'm covering. For example, I'm in the process of working on a story about attacks on drag performers and domestic extremism in the United States. I'm tracking a number of bills moving through various state legislatures. I have a number of different sources I'm in touch with every week, traveling to Tennessee tomorrow, but maybe in Texas the week after that. And so I can kind of sense, because of my experience, where I'm going to be. At the beginning of your career, it's often a bit more hectic than that. You're getting a lot of assignments. You're green, so you have to learn a little bit of everything. And that's an opportunity. That's actually a great thing, because while you might start out in this field thinking you know exactly what you want to do and you know everything and you know what you're going to be best at, you could be surprised. And you might find yourself falling in love with stories or regions of the country or the world that you hadn't considered before. And so it's, I would argue, kind of fun to get out there, work with all different kinds of people, and accept that you're kind of riding that wave in the beginning. So most early career reporters don't have a ton of say in the stories that they initially cover, although you should still learn to pitch, learn to take responsibility for your reporting, always bring your own ideas to the table, even if it's on a broad topic that you've been assigned by someone else. Do it your way, find your voice. We're journalists, and so this isn't about our perspective and opinion. That doesn't mean that you don't bring something special to the table, that because of your unique lived experience, the way you were raised, the life that you've led, the family that you come from, that you can't bring a new perspective or ask questions other people haven't asked before. And you should absolutely, bring that into the early period of your career, because it'll help you grow so much faster and get to the place where you have a beat, you know what you're doing, people really trust you, and now you can set the tone.
Blaine, you also have a beat, Atlanta, and everything within probably 1,000 miles of Atlanta, 24/7. And you have a family, you're a mom. How were you able to, that's miraculous in some regards, that you've been able to find that balance and create those boundaries. And how do you manage all that? And how do you achieve that?
Sometimes that's a good question. I say that very transparently. I think that, and I appreciate you saying it, it's something that somebody told me when I was getting ready to come back from maternity leave. So my daughter is 20 months old today. And so I've been doing this working mom life for about, call it almost a year and a half. Balance looks different every single day. And so, I try and get out of my mind this notion that, I'm going to be here and give 50-50 here, or give whatever percent here at every time, all the time, because it ebbs and flows and it looks different every day. And so right now I'm in Chicago, right? I'm getting ready to shoot a story tomorrow that I'm really excited about. That also takes me away from her. And that means that I can't be there for bedtime tonight. I won't be there tomorrow to take her to school when she wakes up, those types of things. But when I have kind of a down day and I can work from home, I do, and I pour some more time into her. So I really think that balance is this kind of shifting thing that changes all the time. One of the good examples that I give is when I know I'm getting ready to go out of town for a story, for instance. I remember saying, okay, I've got, travel that evening, but cleared the top of the day so that I could take her to her music class and just kind of do what I needed to do. And that helped a lot. I think that also having communication with, kind of your bureau, for me, my bureau, my managers, and just letting them know, that I will, say yes when at most times, that I work hard, what my work ethic looks like. So on the times when I have to say no, or when I have to put family first, I believe that they trust me in that. And so I don't get that pushback. If she's sick and I just got to say, got to scrap this interview, I can't be here today, which happened last week, then that happens, and so I think having that and kind of being empowered to say that as well. The other thing, honestly, I can't, say this enough, my husband's so supportive. Having a supportive husband who's been with me since local days, understands what this looks like, that we communicate openly about this type of stuff, that helps tremendously too. Doesn't mean it's not hard, but that's, that's kind of the bedrock.
I admire and envy all of that, because I think it's true. Maybe you and Antonio and others will correct me, but this business demands a lot. I just
want to add one thing though. I don't want to give off like it's easy. It is very difficult. And it's
yes, of course. Yes,
because I do have a lot of people come and say, oh my God, you figured it out. No, I'm figuring out every day. I'm building this airplane as I fly it, but it's, it's worth trying to do it, because I am very passionate about my career, but my family absolutely comes first. And so putting those things together to create a whole human, yes, it's a struggle, but it's worth it. So I just want to say.
But just as you were talking about earlier about standing in the storm and standing in the chaos with the posture that you and Antonio take literally and figuratively, we have to do this, and it's hard. And to put family first. I mean, personally, I know that I can think of God knows how many work out because I was moving on to the next job or getting on the next plane to go somewhere. And I didn't become a father until late in life. I have a 14-year-old daughter, and hopefully going forward, the business will be kinder to that sort of thing. But in some instances, it is not. Broader question, Dr. James, what are some best practices that are happening or that should happen in the industry that will help journalists find more balance and avoid burnout and deal with all these traumatic situations? What are some best practices that are out there or that you would recommend?
First, I just want to highlight, even this conversation that we were just having now is about really paying attention to first things first, right? What's really important, being clear about what are your values. And that might mean, oh, my values are I want to make sure I'm in good physical health, or my values are I want to spend time with my child or children. That being clear about that allows you to then exercise your voice in those situations because you are aligned with your values. That's the time when we feel overwhelmed and stuck. When we start to do things that are counter to our values, and then we start to feel guilt or resentment or embarrassment, that's what leads us down a really negative path. Now, overall, in terms of what you were sharing or asking, the things about being able to think about what are the things that I need to do to take care of myself. And I think some of these things were shared, and Dr. Wall also mentioned this. What does boundaries really look like, right? Where can I say no? Where can I say yes? How do I even practice that? How do I talk to a colleague and say, I don't know how to say no here, but I need help with that? How do I even select a partner? Our personal lives are really important. How do I maintain my romantic relationship if I'm in one, or even go out on a date? How do I make sure I'm having joy and fun? So these things that are important that then also help us when we're on the job and vice versa. And sometimes we might upregulate the job part, but forget these other things are still crucial and important and significant. And the more that we can fluctuate, because I also agree, balance is not static, as we can fluctuate from one thing to the next, then we can maybe feel that we're in rhythm, and that kind of helps us to go forward.
Dr. Wall, I kind of think I can hear some younger early career journalists out there saying, yeah, that all works for the folks who are veterans and have established themselves, and they can say no, and they can create boundaries and all that. What do you say to young people who are facing this dilemma and are just sort of oh, I wish I could do that. Maybe after 5 years, maybe after 10 years.
It does work well for you. I'm listening to you talk about how beautifully and creatively you balance everything, and that you choose family, and that you make sure you understand what the demands are and what the high cost is. If you're entering the field, part of what you want to recognize is that it's an adventure before you, and you are going to mold it, and you are going to look at what you choose to put in your life. You may have a moment in your development where you can place a lot of time and emphasis on being a journalist, and that might come first until you meet that person or until you develop that. I really love living here in Atlanta. I want to stay here. That it is something that emerges as you go. And so if you're willing to pay the cost, and you are, because you are in journalism now, if you're willing to invest in yourself, and you will, to look at where you want to go, what you want to do, how you want to do that it will create your trajectory of how you want to live in the world. And I really love what Antonia says in terms of what you bring to the table. You have a unique question, a unique voice, a unique strength. And as you begin to develop that and hone that and look at what that means for you, it's going to be a lot easier for you to look at the balance that you need to keep yourself handling the stress, allowing your professional strength to develop, and then moving forward so that you have a whole life.
There's a question that I'm going to try and pose to Antonia and Blaine. It says, someone was reading somewhere that journalists are supposed to be independent and not supposed to represent an organization or a group. Now, the question, I guess, is how do you do that? How do you maintain your independence, and how do you separate yourself from what's happening in front of you and not become an advocate when obviously things are, or apparently things are really one-sided, or you feel strongly about a cause or strongly about an issue or whatever you're facing out there. Antonia.
Sure, I'll take it. I think the first thing is, when you study journalism, or, if you didn't go to school for journalism, you learn it on the job, often through sort of apprentice style positions, right? I started out as a production assistant and assistant to a producer, followed them everywhere. And I learned everything about this job by watching what they did, from, producing an interview to how they wrote their emails. And so you absorb the principles of this job in whatever ways that you can.
Mhm.
And then once you understand those principles, you come back to them time and time and again in your career. It's not something that you learn once and you move on. These are things that you'll have to kind of remind yourself on every big story. Who am I reaching out to? Who are the parties in this story who deserve a voice? Who are the stakeholders here? Who's responsible for what's gone wrong in this community? Where does the buck stop? And once I've identified that person or those people, often it's a groups of people or multiple systems, you need to reach out to every single one of them and do your best as a journalist to get out there, whether that is knocking on doors, whether that is calling people, whether that is reaching out on social media and all the tools that we have today. You come back to these fundamental principles. But things are also, there are gray area issues, right? When we cover murders, murder is not good. We never, as journalists, pose the question, well, should someone be murdered? So there are issues, right, where perhaps there isn't as much a debate over right or wrong, but you're trying to uncover the reality of what happened here, what's going to happen next. You're at the trial. And that's a different set of responsibilities than when you're in the midst of a protest and people are grieving and they're angry and they're coming to journalists and their emotions are flowing out and they don't even know what words are about to come out of their mouth next. And so those are the moments where you need to pause, come back to the fundamental principles, and remember that you're serving an audience outside of yourself. And you're providing them information, whether that's going to help them figure out how to vote and participate in their community, or that's going to help them change the way, you look at the Ohio train derailment and the number of people who have engaged now in conversations about environmentalism and climate, and for whom these were made so personal in this sort of tight community and geographic zone. And so I think that you have to remember you get into this business not to advance your own way of living or your own opinions. You get into this because you're doing a service that's outside of yourself. And so when you find yourself on stories that perhaps make you emotional, you're going to your therapist, you're going to your family because you're processing them as a real human being yourself in real time too. That is okay. But when you're on air, when you're writing your script, come back to the principles here that are always fundamentally about the voices that need to be included and brought to the table, the people who perhaps have been usually excluded from the table, and now you have an opportunity and an obligation to include, to bring into the fold, and the powers that be here, the levers of power that I'm in Brooklyn. I'm sorry, you all have to hear the party happening outside my window right now. But who are the powers that we have to hold accountable here, and how do I get them, in my story, whether that's I'm there with a camera and a microphone in their face, or I've reached out to them and sent them questions over emails. You learn these things in the early stages of your career. You're going to come back to them time and again. I often tell people to trust their guts on these things too, and then go to their managers, your directors, your friends, your fellow colleagues. I've been on stories with Blaine and I've asked Blaine for advice. Right. Actually, I should mention too, I asked Blaine for advice about the relationship side of everything in this business too, because I was like, oh, you got the man and you got the kid and you've got everything so perfect. How do you do it? And she was like, it's not perfect. Let me tell you the truth. Yeah. And that was very helpful to me. We had that real conversation together. And so I've been doing this for a while. I know I'm a good journalist. I love what I do. And I'm still calling people and asking for advice. Be humble and know that that's part of the journey too. You're always going to be reaching back out to people and coming back again to the beginning of your career in some ways.
We've got to wrap up. So if you have a last minute question, put it in there quickly. Hopefully we'll get to it. I want to go around the horn here and ask everyone what their biggest takeaway from all this is, or the biggest moment of advice, and do it really quickly. I will start by saying, I think Antonia really raised a really important point at the end there about, yes, professional help is available, but seek out your colleagues, seek out network in the building that you work and in the community of journalists and at NABJ and through NBCU Academy. I can tell you that I love nothing more than hearing from young people who are trying to figure it out. So you reach out, please. And because I know that I would not be here did I not do that, and did not many someone's respond. So that wasn't very clear, but anyway. So Dr. Wall, biggest takeaway. What should people know take away from this?
People should remember they're not in this by themselves. So we have already seen that there is a community. There's a community when you're on your job, when you're in the newsroom, when you're writing your story, you're not in it by yourself. So don't handle the stress that may lead you to feeling so depressed and cynical. Don't handle it by yourself. Make sure that you connect with help, because there's plenty of help around.
Dr. James, what do you think people should take away from this mostly?
That it's okay to get help. And I think about some people that I've worked with and how it can be so intense and overwhelming, and you might feel like you have to push through it, but you don't. You might feel like being strong is not talking about it, but that is not, in my opinion, being vulnerable, being open, and seeking help, just like we've seen from Antonia and Blaine here. So push through and get that support.
Blaine, what is your last bit of advice, and what you think what everyone should take away from this?
Yeah, a couple quick things. One, I'm also a strong member of team therapy. So therapy is fantastic and it's helped me tremendously. So I'd ask, tell anybody, seek therapy. It's fantastic. Have your tribe, know who your people are that you can talk to, that you can, go to when you're just kind of ugly crying or whatever it is, but people that you can be raw with and real with and kind of understand what this looks like. That helps fortify me, certainly. And then finally, just try and find time. I mean, they always say it's cliche at this point, but it's so true. Take care of you. So whatever that looks like, if it means getting up super early so that you can just have a little bit of time to yourself before you get shot out of a cannon into the crazy day of journalism, whatever it is, your 10 minutes of meditating in the car, take that time for you, be selfish with it, and be unapologetic about it.
Antonia, you have a minute. We have 2 total. I'm going to take the last one.
Got you. Be as proactive about your personal life and your hobbies as you are about your career.
Sounds good.
Not either or. That's my advice.
I thank you all. Very impressive. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure the audience does appreciate it as well. One last thing we want to mention, we invite you to an NBCU Academy Next Level Summit on March 22nd. It's entitled We Are All Storytellers. It's a free virtual conference featuring top leaders from across NBC Universal, again, NBCU Academy. It is a fabulous thing that we all participate and contribute to. So thanks for joining us. I hope this was helpful, and take good care of yourselves.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Thank you all. This was great.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.